Today we're going to turn from the theory of knowledge to metaphysics, the study of what there is, understanding the nature and structure of the world. The theory we're going to take most seriously is Aristotle's. It's been one that has immense influence on the entire history of Western philosophy. But as we will see, there are similar categorical schemes in other cultures as well, and they raise very interesting sorts of issues about what the basic kinds of things in the world are. So let's start with Aristotle. He was a student of Plato, who was in turn a student of Socrates. Here is the categories in Greek. This was a work that even when Aristotle's general approach to philosophy was unpopular, remained a sort of touchstone for anybody who thought about logic, about language, about grammar. And so it begins by laying out a simple scheme of categories. Here are the categories. And notice he doesn't really talk much about what he's doing here. He just says there are a number of basic categories. One, substance. Examples, man, the horse, Socrates. Secondly, quantity, 6 feet tall, 235 square miles. Then, quality, things like white, tall, angry, wise, etc. Relations, like double or greater than. Place, like at the mall or west of Austin. Times, like today, at noon, for a week. Positions, like lying, sitting, standing. States, like armed or puzzled or impressed. Actions, like hit, smile, do, walk, thank. Affections, like to be hit or to be thanked. Those are the 10 basic categories. Now, as soon as you look at this account of categories, you can think, well, what's going on here? If I were to ask you, what are the basic kinds of things in the world? What would you say? Here you go. Sir, what are the basic kinds of things in the world?
Cell things?
Cells. Cell things. Things with cells, like you mean life forms. Plants, animals, people. Okay, those are some things in the world. What are some other things in the world? Yes. Gases. Yes. Energy. Other things? Basic categories of things in the world.
Elements.
Okay, good. Chemical elements, like the ones up on that chart.
Exactly why.
Very good. What else? Yeah.
Weather.
The weather? Yeah, I mean, you meet somebody for the first time, what do you talk about? Basic categories of things in the world? Well, maybe you're a philosopher, like, what do you believe in? So do you think there are such things as events, or just things that have things happen? But no, most people talk about the weather, things like that. Well, there are lots of ways in which you might answer, but probably you wouldn't answer by saying, well, there are substances, and quantities, and qualities, and relations, and times, and places, and actions, and affections, and states, and positions. So what is Aristotle doing here? One way of looking at this is to say, all right, these are categories, but what are they categories of? Are we talking about, well, what exactly? He's giving you categories, kinds, you might say, but kinds of what? Now, what are some possible answers to that question? What do these strike you as categories of? Any thoughts? Yeah?
Categories of things in human existence.
Categories of things in human existence. That would be one way of looking at it. Other possibilities, yeah? Concepts, so they could be kinds or categories of concepts.
Categories of circumstances.
Categories of circumstances.
Categories of human relationships.
Categories of human relationships.
Or relationships in general.
Or relationships in general. Any other ideas? Yeah?
Categories of anything conceivable.
Categories of anything conceivable. Now let's take a look at something that you might have noticed. Look at the examples of substance. Man, the horse, Socrates. Grammatically speaking, what are those? Nouns, exactly. Proper or common nouns. What about, or noun phrases like the horse? How about things like, under the quantity heading, 6 feet tall, 235 square miles? Those are, adjective phrases maybe, something like that. What about quality, like white, tall, angry, wise? Adjectives, right? What about relation terms like double or greater than? less than, bigger than, and so on. Yeah, they're comparative adjectives, right? Or something like that. Or, I mean, double or between, might be prepositions. How about place at the mall, west of Boston? What are those?
Nouns.
They're what?
Nouns.
Nouns?
Or
At the mall is
prepositional.
they're prepositional phrases, yeah. What about today at noon for a week?
At noon for a week.
Okay, some of these are prepositional phrases, and what about today? What is today?
Study.
Didn't you guys ever go through the 7th grade and learn any grammar? It's an adverb, okay? Like now, it's an adverb. What about things like lying, sitting, standing? Okay, good, they're parts of verbs, right? They're participles. What about states like armed or puzzled or impressed? Because they function like adjectives, but they're also formed from verbs. They're past participles of verbs. What about things like hit, smile, do, walk, thank? Verbs, right? How about to be hit, to be thanked? Good, they are passive verbs. Now you might think, all right, there's some sort of relationship here between grammatical categories and these. So let's think about some possible answers here. Some of you have said kinds of thing, kinds of conceivable thing, kinds of things human beings encounter, and so on. So that is one possible answer. He's giving you a categorization of kinds of things. It's a little bit strange because we would have tended to say plants, animals, human beings, gases, solids, liquids, chemical elements, or, we would have been tempted to say things like that rather than like this. But still, maybe that's what we're getting here, an account of kinds of thing. Maybe an account of kinds of basic thing. After all, he's not presumably saying, well, okay, look, there are weather conditions. So there is rain, there is sunshine, there is snow, there are storms, etc. Oh, and what about means of transportation? There are horses, there are carts, there are chariots, etc., etc. Maybe he's giving you something more fundamental than that, kinds of basic things. Maybe it's kinds of being. Sometimes Aristotle introduces this by saying, being is said in many senses. There are many senses in which a thing can be said to be. And then he gives you this category list. So you can be a man. You can be tall. You can be lying. You can be sitting. You can be thanked. You can be west of Boston, etc., etc. And so maybe it's kinds of being. They do seem to correspond to grammatical functions. That's one clue we have. And in general, Aristotle is approaching language and approaching this question of what there is as parallel questions. What is there? Aristotle says, well, look at our language. Our language is something that is designed for us to talk about things that are. And so a good way to start in thinking about what there is in the world is to look at the structure of language. What are the kinds of things that language recognizes? And if you start doing that and going down the parts of speech, you say, aha, nouns or noun phrases. Classically, that's something that stands for a person, place, or thing, right? And then you can say, but then they're verbs. They stand for actions or for things that are done to you, and so on. And you might start generating a list like this. It is going to be a fundamental idea of Aristotle's that we analyze metaphysical questions by looking at language. The structure of the world is reflected in the structure of language. And so we can think about the structure of the world by thinking about linguistic structures. Not all philosophers think of things this way. You might think, no, it's science that tells us the structure of the world. You want to understand what there is in the world? Look at that chart, periodic table of the elements. That's what tells you, not something that starts with the English language. It would be very strange to walk into intro chemistry and have the professor say, now what are the kinds of things we talk about? Somebody says, oh gosh, salt. Okay, good, we talk about salt. What else do we talk about? Hurricanes. Yes, we talk about hurricanes. What else? Shoes. Yeah, shoes. And start going through basic elements like that, right? We don't do that in science. So Aristotle's way of thinking about this is very much focused on our everyday conceptions of what there is in the world and our everyday ways of talking about it. Well, there's something else that we should notice about this list of categories. They are not all equal. One category is more important, he says, than all the rest. The category of substance is really the most fundamental. Now why? Well, all the other categories depend on substance. We've got qualities of substances, quantities of substances, relations between substances. Substances do things. They have things done to them. They occupy certain positions. They are in certain states. And so these are the fundamental units. Substances, everything else is really a quality of a substance or a quantity of a substance or a relation between substances, etc., etc., etc. So substance is really the most fundamental category. Therefore, he says, there are many senses in which a thing can be said to be, but the most fundamental of those senses is to be a substance, to be a thing. The focal meaning of being, he says, the focal meaning of just being something that is to be a substance. The world consists fundamentally of substances. And then those substances stand in certain relations to one another. They have certain properties or qualities. And then we can start counting those substances and applying numerical terms to them. They do things, they have things done to them, they occupy certain states and positions. And in general, we can say the world consists of substances that stand in all these relations, have these properties, do things, and have things done to them. So the world fundamentally consists of substances. Well, now, what is a substance? A substance is a this. Okay? It's something we could, well, perhaps point to. It's something we can indicate in that way. It also answers a question. What is it? Suppose I look at this thing. Well, let's take something simple. What is it? This isn't a trick question. Okay?
It's chalk.
It's chalk. Yes, good. And notice it's a particular piece of chalk. I can say, what is this? It is a particular thing, a this, but also it occupies a certain kind. We can say it is a chalk, a piece of chalk. So I can say this piece of chalk, that this is making it particular, but it's also a thing of a certain kind. It is a piece of chalk. What is this? A microphone. Again, a particular thing of this, but also of a certain kind. So if I say, what is it? Well, you answer, a microphone. Notice you answer with something that is a noun or a noun phrase. You answer with something that actually locates something within the sphere of substance. You don't say, I say, what is this? You say, it's dark gray. Okay? You're naming a quality, but you haven't answered my question. Or you say, well, it's 9 inches long. That doesn't tell me what it is. What if, God, what's another, yeah, you say, it's in your hand, right? I say, what is it? It's in your hand. That tells me the placement of it, gives me a certain relation to me. It does not tell me what it is. And the same thing, if you give an action or, well, it's not really doing anything, but it's having something done to it, right? I'm holding it in my hand, so it's being held. So if I say, what is it? You say, well, it's being held by you. Again, doesn't tell me what it is. So the other categories don't tell me what the thing is. Only substance does. I've got to say it's a microphone. And then I've got information. Now sometimes there is something where I might say, I don't know what it is, like this thing. I don't mean the whole thing, I just mean this top of it. What would you call this top? What is this? Right, here's like an arm, and then there's something at the top of it. What is it? I don't know. I don't have a word for it. But notice it won't do to say, well, it's gray. Or it's on top of that thing. That doesn't tell me what it is. And so you've got to give me something that locates it within substances. Well, this tells us some important things. A substance is always something of a kind. And I identify it, I tell you what it is typically by identifying it as a thing of that kind. I say it's a piece of chalk or it's a microphone. And so I am giving you this particular thing, this object, and then I'm locating it in terms of a kind. Well, some kinds are quite specific. Some kinds are more general. So, for example, I can say piece of chalk, and that's, where did it go? Here we go. That's something it's specific kind. I don't really know how to get much more specific than that. But you could also go more general. What is this? Suppose you don't know the word for chalk in English, but you still want to say something to me about what it is. What could you say?
Writing utensil.
Okay, good, it's a writing utensil. That's something that would locate it in a more general kind. So we've got this piece of chalk, a specific kind, that it is a piece of chalk, a more general kind, it is a writing implement. What about this? Now, I might be very specific. I could say, what is this? Well, a microphone. That's already at a certain intermediate level of specificity. I could be more specific. I could say, oh, it's an Audio Technica AEWT5400 Aristotelian. Okay, and that would be a very specific kind of thing it is. Or I could say it's a microphone, that's a more general kind. I could be even more general than that. Can you think of something that would be a more general term that might apply to this?
Electronic.
An electronic device. Can you get more general than that? It's an object, a physical object, right? Now that's not really helpful, but on the other hand, if I say, what is it? You say, it is a physical object. You're giving me some information. You're locating it in a very general kind. So, we've got two things we can say here about substances. First of all, they are of kinds. More specific kinds, but also of more general kinds. Kinds are structured in this way, from highly specific to highly general. And also, it is a this. So Aristotle sometimes puts it this way. A substance is a this such. It is this particular instance of such and such a kind. It is this piece of chalk, that man, that microphone, and so on. Well, he says substance is what really exists in the primary sense. You want to say, what is there in the world? Best answer, most clear-cut answer is just say substance. Now, broadly speaking, I think substance here is more or less what we mean by an object, a thing. And so what is there in the world? You could say things, objects. And you're basically saying the same thing that Aristotle is trying to say here. What is there? Substance. There are substances, there are things, there are objects. He does draw a distinction between primary substances and secondary substances, because we often talk about kinds of things as if they were themselves things. So he says, look, in the primary sense, a substance is a this such, this piece of chalk, that microphone. Those are substances. But we can also use substance in a secondary sense to refer to the kinds. So I could talk about microphones, or pieces of chalk, or human beings. There I'm referring to kinds, and those are also said to be substances, but in a secondary sense. So in the primary sense, a substance is a particular thing of a certain kind. In this more general, secondary sense, we can talk about kinds themselves as substances. Now, in English, we would sometimes talk about kinds by saying the kind or the species, tiger, for example, or the kind, microphone. But we usually do it by using what linguists refer to as a bare plural. We just talk about microphones, or pieces of chalk, or people. And those bare plural nouns are things, or noun phrases for that matter, are things that really seem to be talking about the whole kind. I can say things, and notice in saying something like this, I'm not committing myself to talking about all the individual things. I can say birds fly, and that's true because I'm talking about the kind, birds. Now, are there birds that do not fly? What examples? Chickens. Or, good, penguins. What do you call them? Ostriches and so on. Right, I mean, there are all sorts of birds that don't, right? And then there are birds that are injured and don't fly, or birds that are sick and don't fly. So there are birds that don't fly, but nevertheless I can truly say birds fly. Why? Because I'm talking about the kind. I'm talking about the secondary substance there, not the primary substance. Now, what that tells us is that, what is there in the world? Well, basically, the simplest answer and the most direct answer, the best answer is substances. I mean the particular things of these kinds. But of course, we can often answer in terms of the kinds. Well, there are plants and animals and people and solids and liquids and gases. And notice what I'm doing there. I'm using these bare plurals. I'm really talking there about kinds of things. And that's an acceptable sort of answer too. So, we can predicate things not only of the individual objects, but of the kinds. And here is an important test in thinking about these things. A substance can be a subject linguistically. We can predicate things of it. We can say, this piece of chalk is, what are some things true of it? White. It is white.
It's chalky.
It's chalky, yes. It is cylindrical. right? We can say various things about it. This microphone is what?
Gray and black.
Yeah, gray and black. What else? We can predicate things of it. We can say it, would produce sound if I were to turn it on, and so on. So we can say all sorts of things about substances. And we can do that with kinds too. We can say tigers are striped, or pieces of chalk write, or microphones make noise, or philosophy majors are smart. And in saying these things, we're talking about the kind, not necessarily of each individual thing of the kind. We're saying something about a kind. Well, if a substance is of this such, that gives us one criterion for identifying substances. It's a particular thing of a certain kind. This, that is of such and such a kind. And so that's one criterion that's really built into the definition of substance. But Aristotle says there are other criteria. For example, there are no degrees of substance. There are degrees of qualities, for example. So, let's think about, what's a good one? Tall. There are degrees of being tall, right? One person can be taller than another person. Or think about the piece of chalk. It's white. Can something be whiter than something else? Sure. I mean, actually, if you've done any camera work, you realize there are all sorts of different colors within the spectrum of white, and things can be more or less white. And so this is white, for example, but it's not as white as that screen with the projection on it, etc. What about some other things that we could have adjectives for? My shirt is what? What's something you might predicate of it? Okay, it's green, and so similarly things can be more or less green. Anything else that's true about it?
Buttons.
It has buttons. Can things have more or fewer buttons? Sure. Now, what about substance itself? Are there degrees of being a shirt? Could you say, man, that shirt is like really a shirt. That's way more a shirt than my shirt. That doesn't make sense, does it? Or what about me being a human being? There aren't degrees of being a human being. You can't say, wow, that Bonomac, he's only sort of a human being. That doesn't make any sense, or he's really a human being. I mean, I guess there are sort of loose ways of talking about this. I've heard people say he's a real mensch, and they didn't mean he's really a human being, way more a human being than you are. That's a term that sort of starts meaning something other than just locating something within a kind. So what are some other examples of this? Well, we talked about tigers, for example. Can you be more or less a tiger? Yeah.
If you go back to the tiger, you could find examples of animals that, were more tiger or less tiger, depending on how they evolved.
All right, that's interesting. If you look at the evolutionary history of tigers, for example, maybe you can say, well, this is tiger-like. It's sort of a tiger, and this is like really a tiger, and so on. So maybe you can actually see degrees of these kinds as you look at the evolutionary history of the species. Yeah?
Not like crossbreeds of dogs.
Crossbreeds of dogs. Yeah, I had an Australian Shepherd, but she wasn't purebred. She was a mix. I don't know anything more about her because my kids actually found her on the access road of I-35, almost getting hit by a minivan. And so that dog was probably part Chow, part Australian Shepherd, part who knows what else. And now my daughter has a purebred Australian Shepherd, so maybe you could say, well, that's more of an Australian Shepherd than my Australian Shepherd was. Maybe something that's part wolf, part dog is, not as much dog as either one of those. So maybe if we can mix kinds together, we can start making sense of this idea.
But wouldn't that just be secondary, not primary? Like primary is a dog, and secondary is an Australian Shepherd.
Now that's an interesting point. You might say, here's the right way to understand these. Think about highly specific kinds and then more general kinds. And so if we're thinking about highly specific kinds, like being a purebred Australian Shepherd, there's no such thing as being more or less of that. Then if you think about bloodlines of various breeds of dogs being mixed, you can say, well, that's more Australian Shepherd than this one is. And so that's somehow rising up to a more general level. And you might think the same about tigers with the evolutionary history. If you really mean the specific species we have in mind now, there's no more or less of that. It's just that things can look more or or less like that, even though they're a different species. And so it's by rising up and comparing kinds now that we're doing this, not really. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what to say about some of these cases. Yes?
Like one of the things you can determine like how similar like genetic-wise an animal is to another animal is if you can breed and produce offspring. I'm sure like whether or not that offspring is like viable or like can produce for its own, but like you can breed like a horse and a donkey, you get a mule, or like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years ago, humans and Neanderthals bred, and they produced viable offspring. So like genetically speaking, it's practical to say that you can be more, like closer to this thing like that. It's not as simple as just like, you're this thing or you're not. Like it's more organic.
Well, okay, that's a good point. It might be that modern genetics, actually with respect to biological species, makes Aristotle look outmoded here. Because you start looking at things like this and you can say, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure what to say about this. For example, I don't know anything about my own deep evolutionary history, but my forehead is a very Neanderthal-looking forehead. I mean, that crease in the middle of my forehead, that's not a sign of age. I've had that since I was 12. And it's not because I was this deeply worried philosophical child. It's really because that's the way my forehead slopes. It goes very much like, that. And so if you were to somehow, please don't do this, but if you were somehow to look at my skull underneath, it would look very caveman-like. So yes, there are all sorts of mixtures, and actually people are figuring out that yes, Homo sapiens bred with Neanderthals and Denisovans and a variety of other early hominid groups. And so we're all much more mucks than we might have initially thought. Yeah.
What about like salts? Like Himalayan pink salt is saltier than table salt.
Ooh, yes, Himalayan pink salt is saltier than table salt. So you can be saltier than something else. Yeah, I suppose that's right. Maybe you remember the joke from Futurama. This is the saltiest thing I've ever tasted, and I won't say the heaping bowl of salt. I once said that on Facebook about caviar. I don't know if you've ever tasted caviar, but it is the saltiest thing you've ever tasted. And I said, look, that was the saltiest thing I've ever tasted, and I once ate a heaping bowl of salt. So this old friend said, why did you eat a heaping bowl of salt? Like, yeah, it's a Futurama reference. Although I'm now getting off the subject, but when I was a kid, the best part of a bag of pretzels was the salt in the bottom. You eat the pretzels so you can get at the salt, not just with my finger in it.
How's your blood pressure?
Terrible. My blood pressure is terrible. So yeah, I still do that sort of. I eat tortilla chips with the salt. Yeah, so that's why my blood pressure was once measured at 220 over 160. So it's amazing that I'm still alive doing this. By the way, anybody have some salt? This is making me really want salt. Okay. Now, a substance is a this such then. It is something that he says doesn't have degrees, but as we've seen, we can debate that. There's surely no more or less being a substance, but it does feel like there might be more or less being a cat or being an Australian shepherd, etc., etc. But now here's the key thing. Substances admit contrary qualities. So a substance can actually have contrary qualities at different times and still be the same substance. For example, right now I am talking, and in a moment I will be silent. And you might think, whoa, deep contradiction here. Bonnebach is both talking and not talking. Ooh. Right, contradiction. So there is no Bonnebach. No, look, you'd say, it's perfectly fine for me to be talking one moment and silent the next. Or I can start out being a small baby, I'm not tall, but I can grow and become tall. Or, I know this from experience, I can get fat, I can get thin, etc. I can change various qualities that I have. I might be standing, I might be sitting. I can have these contrary qualities and still be me. Now, of course, I can't do it at the same time. I can't be, let's say, standing and sitting at the same time. I can't be talking and silent at the same time. But nevertheless, I can have those contrary qualities at different times and still be me. Now, other things, he says, are not like that. Consider the color green. Can it vary and have contrary qualities? Could you say, wow, yeah, green is, yesterday green was kind of dark, but today green is light? Doesn't make any sense, right? Yeah.
All right, but what about like people who view colors differently? Because the way I see your shirt's greenness is different than, let's say, he sees your shirt's greenness. So.
Okay, good. People could perceive colors differently. In fact, just last night I read an article about a color that, according to a survey of like 30,000 people, is the most beautiful color in the world. And I don't see an example of it here exactly, although actually your shirt is really close to it. And it's like this blue-green. And you look at it and you think, I don't know whether to call that blue. I don't know whether to call it green. I don't know whether, it's sort of hard to categorize. I don't have a name for that. But it's the kind of thing that will look different to different people. So some people will see this color and say it's green. Others will look at it, most will look at it and say it's a kind of blue. And even within that range, people might perceive it differently. Some people are going to have a different perception because they're partially colorblind, or they have a different set of sort of combination of cones and rods and so on in their retina. And so, yes, there can be different perceptions. But the question is whether the color green itself, or that color, which I think is called now Mars blue, whether that color is something that changes day to day. But it doesn't, right? Your perception of it might differ from my perception of it, but the color itself doesn't change. Or what about the height of being 6 feet tall? Being 6 feet tall doesn't change. I might change, I might grow, and then I might shrink when I hit old age, but that's something that is not going to make 6 feet tall change. You're not going to say, 6 feet tall just it seems taller today. Now, it is true that in the old days, not many people were 6 feet tall. That was very tall. Now, lots are. It's not that tall. But still, the quantity is the same. Substances, however, can vary. Well, let's look at an alternative conceptual scheme, a scheme of categories that arises in classical Indian philosophy. I think it's really useful to put it up against Aristotle's scheme because it's trying to do very much the same thing. And a general pattern I've found in philosophy, when you look at philosophy in different traditions, is that thinkers are asking many of the same questions. However, they tend to come up with different answers. Answers that partly overlap, partly agree, but also diverge in various interesting ways. So let's take a look at an account in classical Indian metaphysics. Much earlier than in Western philosophy, the divide between realists and idealists became clear in Indian philosophy. It's something that goes back thousands of years, rather than a couple of hundred years as it does in the West. Now, an idealist thinks that everything is mind-dependent. Everything depends on the mind, is in some sense a projection of or construction of the mind. The mental infuses everything, and everything we experience is really something that is a mental construct. So the idealist is somebody who thinks the world is something like a mental construction. Now, there are lots and lots of idealist schools of thought in India. Buddhism is the most obvious, but also a number of schools of Hinduism, including the main one, Advaita Vedanta, is something that is thoroughly idealist. However, realism is also strongly represented in Indian philosophy, and in particular the philosophers of two other Hindu schools, logic and particularism, Nyaya and Vaisheshika. They are also realist in orientation. That means they think that not everything is mind-dependent. Some things are independent of the mind. Some things are really out there, have an existence that is totally independent of us. They are not in any sense a mental construction. So they think this typically about the ordinary objects of the world. Rocks, stones, well they have the same thing, aren't they? What was I having you by there? Mountains, trees, those are things that are really out there in the world. They are not our own constructions. So these objects are things that are really out there, independent of us. They persist over time. They exist in time and in space. They are things that the world is made up of. Well, today we're going to look at a particular version of Indian realism. This is part of the school known as Vaisheshika, or particularism. And one of the chief thinkers here is Kanana. I will enumerate everything that has the character of being here. This is around the year 100. So the goal here in the Vaisheshika Sutra is to do just what Aristotle is doing, I think. Start naming the kinds of being and start saying what there is in the world. So this is a metaphysical project. What is this? And we get a theory of categories spelling out in the most general way, the basic kinds of things that are. So that is the basic question of ontology. What is there? And as Willard Van Orman Quine said about, around 1950, so this is now almost 70 years ago, it can be answered very simply in one word, everything. And everyone will agree about that answer. But the question is, well, okay, what does everything include? What does everything encompass? So there's still room for disagreement. And the answer in Indian philosophy here is, well, what there is are categories, the types of things to which words refer. So the goal here is to lay out these categories, these kinds of things. And again, like Aristotle, the goal is to say, let's start with language. We're talking about the world when we use language, and so the basic things we're referring to in language must be the basic constituents of the world. So let's think about the kinds of things words refer to. Well, what are the basic kinds of things that words refer to? Here are the three basic categories, in at least the early versions of Vaisheshika. Substances, like a pot, a cloth, fire, or the soul. Notice some of those are particular objects, like a pot or a cloth, but others are actually mass terms, like fire, or for that matter, cloth in general, as opposed to this particular piece of cloth. Then there's quality, like square, blue, okay? Things that would have a space as qualities in Aristotle's scheme. So we've more or less got what Aristotle would consider substances, what he would consider qualities, and then motions or actions. Again, one of those things that Aristotle mentions in his categories, things like move or eat or throw. So we've got grammatical categories represented here of nouns and adjectives and verbs. Those are the basic categories. They are three things from Aristotle's list. And in this account, they are the basic kinds of things. They are the things that are existent. Okay, there's a special term in Sanskrit for that, sat. They are the things that really exist, are in the most basic sense. So we've got things, we've got qualities of things, we've got things that things do. But now, is that enough? Does that cover everything? Aristotle, after all, has 7 more categories. Things like having things done to you, or being in a certain state, being in a certain position, times, places, etc. And so there is more to be said. Now, as Vaisheshika develops, there are additional categories added, but they're not the same as Aristotle's. And so I think there's something very interesting to think about here. What gets added are things that have a different sort of character. They're different kinds of categories. So, here's one of them. Universality. Things like triangularity. Things like being a tiger, being a human being. Okay? Then there is a category of inherence. The pot's being blue, for example. My talking. There are individualizers. These are the things that differentiate the atoms. That put the this in the this such. Okay? After all, here you've got, let's say, one Dixie cup and another seemingly identical Dixie cup. What makes them different? Well, this is this Dixie cup, that's that Dixie cup. But otherwise, they seem qualitatively identical. And so you might think what's individuating them is just the difference between the this and the that. And then finally, absences. Like the elephant in here. Is there an elephant in here? No, we have a lack of an elephant. We have the absence of an elephant. Okay, and so here's a category of absences, lacks, holes, if you will. Now the first 3 of those are things that are present. But the last one, of course, absences aren't present, they're absent, that's the whole point. But they can all be talked about in name. Yeah?
So why is individualizer necessary when we could just say, well, this Dixie cup is in this position in space, while this Dixie cup is in another? They can't ever overlap 100% in space.
Good. All right, good question. Do we really need these categories? We'll come to that question about absences and about individualizers in just a second, because I want to talk about each more individually. But yes, here's the proposal. Here's what differentiates this Dixie cup from that Dixie cup. One's here, and the other's there. Now, is that a good answer? Will that suffice? Why not? What's the difference between here and there? Looks like this place and that place. So we're back to the same problem. You might say, well, this one's to the right of that one. Ooh, but what you see is to the right, I see is to the left. And you might worry, wait a minute, I don't know how to find something that's a clear anchor here. Anyway, we'll talk more about that in a second. Here is the sort of picture that we get with inherence. We get a quality and a substance. So, for example, my shirt and the color green. There is a relationship between those two. You can't describe the shirts being green by just saying, look at the shirt. Look at the color green. You gotta tie them together somehow, right? It is the shirt that is being green. It's not like I see a shirt, and I see the color green. You might see that if you're looking at a shirt over here that's some other color, and then something else in the ground of your vision is green. In this case, you're saying, no, the shirt is green. You gotta tie the shirt and the green together. And that's what the relation of inherence is supposed to do. It's the green in the shirt, right? Or the white in the piece of chalk. That's something that ties the quality to the substance. What about individualizers? A philosopher named Max Planck came up with a great example of a universe in which there is really just a pair of objects. Two identical black iron spheres. Okay, they're qualitatively identical. They can't be differentiated in any way. They're the same mass, exactly the same shape. They're just alike. But nevertheless, there are two of them. They're different. What distinguishes them? How are they different? And philosophers debated this for about a decade. One way of doing it is exactly the strategy he used. To say, well, wait a minute, they're in different positions in space. This one is here, that one's there. But now as soon as you do that, you can say, well, okay, but how do I differentiate this bit of space from that bit of space? And it's hard to see how to do that in a non-question-making way. Now notice it's important that there are only these two things in that universe. If I had a third thing, I could talk maybe about their different relations to that third thing. But if it's just those two, I don't know how to do it. For example, if I'm holding the Dixie cups, I could say, well, this one's in my right hand, this one's in my left hand. I could try, or this one's closer to me, I could try to use that. But if we've just got the two Dixie cups, or in this case, just the two iron spheres, it's hard to see what to do. And so as this tradition went on, people became more and more convinced that they needed the little this thing, the little individualizer. And here's a way of making it more modern as a problem. There are lots and lots of electrons in the world, aren't there? But they all have the same electrical charge, they all have the same mass, so what differentiates them? How do you tell this electron from that electron within the atom? It's not a trivial question. And the Indian philosophers actually were atomists and thought they needed this to even explain the differences among otherwise identical atoms. Absences. Notice there's nothing on the slide, okay? There's an absence of an elephant on that slide, the absence of a microphone, the absence of a human being. They're all absent, right? Now, you might think, why on earth would I need to talk about absences? Well, here's a way of thinking about it. It's obvious what would make it true that there's an elephant in the room. We look and we see an elephant, right? I say, what do you mean there's an elephant in the room? I say, look over there, there's an elephant. Now, there's another elephant in the room. But what would make there's no elephant in the room true? Now in this room, there is no elephant. What makes that true? If I say there's a microphone in the room, this makes it true, right? Actually, so does this. So it's easy to point to that, but if I say there's no elephant in the room, what's making that true? The absence of an elephant, right? Okay, now, by the way, there's now an expression. The elephant in the room is the obvious thing being overlooked by everyone, and that comes from, actually, the first Western idealist philosopher, George Berkeley, who challenged scientists to a debate on the question of whether there was an invisible elephant in the room. Yeah, only a philosopher would think of that. But anyway, that's something that is different from this ancient Indian view, where the elephant in the room is the thing that doesn't exist. And the question is, how do you understand the claim that it doesn't exist? Now here's the thing that's strange about these additional categories. How do we know anything about them? How do we know about universals, like the color green, as opposed to the green of this shirt or your shirt or grass or something like that? How do we know something about triangularity itself as opposed to this or that triangle? Inherence. How do we understand or know anything about this relationship of the thing that is tying the green and the shirt together? We can see the shirt, we can see the color, but we don't see what ties them together. And so it's hard to understand how we know about that. What about particularizers? The thing that is the this that distinguishes that atom from this atom, or this Dixie cup from that Dixie cup. Again, we don't see that, we just see the qualities. So where is our knowledge of that sort of thing coming from? And finally, absences. It's obvious that we don't see absences. I can't just see or hear the absence of an elephant. And so how do we know about absences? Now, in some sense, it feels like there must be a good way of answering all those questions. But it's not obvious what those answers are going to be. All right, I'm going to skip that because I always try to explain it. It was the central idea of my dissertation many years ago, and nobody ever understands it, so I skip it. It's too bad. That's my most important contribution. All right, now, all the other categories depend on substance. That's something we've seen as a claim in Aristotle. It is also a claim in classical Indian metaphysics. The qualities, the motions, the absences are always qualities or motions or absences of substance. These are things that depend on substance. Yeah?
Do absences depend on things that do actually exist, or can absences apply to like things that are entirely not real? So if I were to envision in my mind a sphere of some unknown substance and it's not there, is it an absence of that thing?
Great question. I could just as easily talk about the absence of a unicorn, not only in this room but anywhere. And so you're right, it doesn't have to be a kind of thing that I know to exist. And that makes it more disturbing how we know about absences. You might think, well, I know how to identify the presence of an elephant, and I can't do that here. But I might not know how to identify the presence of a unicorn or of somebody's imaginary thing. So you're absolutely right. That actually makes it a more serious problem to think about how we might know about the absences of things that not only don't exist here, but don't exist anywhere. Okay, well finally, there are some basic kinds of non-composite substance. And so in Vaisheshika, there is a link between the grammar part of this and then the scientific part. Because once we say the most fundamental kind of thing in the world is substance, then we can say, but what are the most fundamental substances? And the answer within classical Indian metaphysics is, there are basic kinds of substance, out of which other substances are formed. Earth, air, fire, water, the ether, which is something like the vacuum within they all. In other words, space and time within which they exist. And everything else results from combining those. You get the same idea in ye olde periodic table. Earth, air, fire, and water. Or in its modern equivalent up there in the wall. So we don't have to think of this as totally divorced from a scientific account of what the fundamental constituents are. We just go to substance, and then we say, and what are the basic kinds of substance? Then we turn to science for an answer.